This week, my tour of the National Park System takes a turn for the sci-fi, or at least the hard science. I have mentioned before that the National Park Service was bigger than I had ever realized, but even then I really had no idea what I was getting into. Not only does the park system cover the wild and extreme and places to escape and to relax, like hot springs, it also covers places that represent moments in time that have changed the world in ways that we live with every day. Today's park is one of those historically pivotal sites that the National Park System preserves. This is our history preserved and yet made accessible. The past turned on this place, and yet you can just go visit, walk up and touch it. So I'm poking around the Appalachians some more, looking at this 21st century rerun of some catastrophic floods that were visited upon similar communities a century ago. And I'm reminded of the weird ways my own life crosses threads with the Manhattan Project. See, my mother is from Tennessee, and her father was one of those out-of-staters who worked on different aspects of the dams of the Tennessee Valley Authority. Also known as the TVA, this massive federal project brought electricity and 20th century technology and prosperity to the Appalachians. Many of the communities had been stranded in the 19th, or in some cases, the 18th century. The Norris Dam on the Clinch River was the first dam of this massive electrification project, which in turn would provide power that made the Oak Ridge National Laboratory project in East Tennessee possible. And as a result, it provided enriched uranium to Los Alamos in New Mexico. And you can just go visit this place today. And considering what it takes to build a lab of any sort, it says so much about the people who put this place together in a very short amount of time. There weren't even things like nail guns, and all the pipes were metal, so they had to be welded, and there was no Tyvek, only tar paper. All sorts of the building innovations we take for granted that cause buildings to rise up so fast didn't exist then. And the other stunning thing, the TVA is just about a century old, meaning that the U.S. and, well, the world has been using electricity as a utility instead of a party trick for just over 100 years. This also helps us realize what a baby technology electricity is and how young all the other things it has made possible also are. And so while many parts of the Appalachians are devastated, in many places just over the next ridge, everything's kind of just the same. Which means that all the places where the trees weren't sent down the mountain, they are showing off their brilliant colors. So if you'd like to peep at some leaves and consider a both anxious and admirable chapter of American history, and spend some time thinking about all the history threads that flow in and out of this place in these very old mountains, consider a trip to the Oak Ridge National Laboratory outpost of the Manhattan Project in eastern Tennessee. Episode 131, The Fruits and Nuts of America, but the natives, not the imports. Hello and welcome to the history of American food. So far, most of the food I've spoken about in this podcast have been imports. The foods people brought with them to plant in what they saw as the empty garden of America. But this week it's time to look at some of the foods that were, at last, getting incorporated into the regular, somewhat mainstream North American diet. I'll also be poking at the question of why most of these items are absent in the modern middle-of-the-road American diet, at least so far. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that I will never succeed in leading a charismatic movement, religious, revolutionary, or even a health crusade. After reading through all sorts of research of the very earliest American vegetarian or vegetable diet, it struck me that diet and really all charismatic movements are about telling you what not to do, with alternating penalties and wild impossible rewards combined with oversimplification and the elimination of choices. But I am forever getting caught up in the beauty and complexity and reveling in the ever-ramifying food choices that are out there for us, looking both forward and back. As a result, I have concluded my career choices are limited. What I am sure you are wondering, does my moping about my limited future opportunities have to do with this week's topic? Well, it is time to make the American food scene even more complex by bringing in local plant foods, the native vegetation. There is a stunning array of plant foods and flavors that are unique to North America, that were largely ignored and even rolled over by the pre-19th century Americans. Except where starvation or instant recognition played a role, your average colonist and immigrant did their darndest to ignore the foods that were just laying around for the taking. So what was wrong with these people? Okay, I answered some of that in season 1. These were city people and not farmers, and not people who really knew how to work the land. And they largely ignored and even sneered at any local knowledge the people already living here had to offer. Granted, the social structures on both sides of the divide, European and indigenous, made it hard for women to meet, talk, and swap plant knowledge, even when there wasn't a giant gulf of language between them. But largely, at least in the case of European women and the men who circumscribed their lives, there was endless scorn, larded all about with ignorance and poorly directed pity. In many writings on the topic, if indigenous foods were considered at all, they often came down to sentiments resembling, what did these savages know about making food? I mean, proper food, fit for a Christian. Sure, you could survive on it, but who would want to? And so, except for those foods that were necessary to fend off starvation, the corn, the squash, and the beans, and those foods that were close enough to their European cousins to be acceptable, like bear, deer, fish, a few berries, beach plums, rose hips, and leafy greens, the bounty of American food, plant food especially, was left largely untouched and unregarded. But in the 19th century, more farmers from the disintegrating Prussian states that would soon reform as Germany, and a growing number of people from Central and Northern Europe would arrive. They had been driven to the desperate recourse of emigration by a combination of petty border wars, succession fights, and approximately a decade of harder-than-common famines. Unlike many of the 18th century immigrants, many of these people had been farmers, and some of them had even been prosperous and successful until circumstances had ruined them. For some, it had been war and the requisition of food, of work animals, of children. These things took too much from them. For others, the continuous visitation of cold, dark summers of the hungry 40s and the resulting too much rain wiped them out. For some, it was the laws that made it so each farm was divided evenly between all offspring. And this left many people without enough land to farm. And in Ireland, the conditions that culminated in the Great Hunger of 1845 to 1852, they were already in motion and chasing people to try their luck in the great unknown of the new America. And so these people, they not only came as farmers, they often also came as families. And this meant they had practice in the ways of coaxing more food from the land. In many of the same ways, so many of those kidnapped and stolen African farm kids from the 18th century used their knowledge to eke a bit of extra food out of the American landscape. They all understood that foraging was an essential part of living as a farmer, and they had methods for sussing out what was good to eat and what wasn't. It's stunning to imagine, but the metal plowshare has barely 300 years of use in Europe. The first ones arrived in Holland in the 18th century, probably based on observing iron ones used in China. And their arrival kicked off a farming revolution in Europe and soon America. Because before the arrival of iron, fields were far less productive, and a larger share of the plant foods eaten by everyone had been obtained by foraging. The earliest colonists to North America, with visions of farming dancing in their heads, bethought themselves as tamers of this new land. They would shape it under the pegs of their harrows and then later under the blade of the plow. But as we know, at the start, in those early harrowing days, pun completely intended, it did not go so well. It was different with many of the people in that batch of 19th century immigrants, especially those hoping to continue farms rather than learning how to farm on the fly. They already had it in their heads that foraging, getting to know the land, and what there was to eat was part of the farming playbook. And so finally, the fruit and nut bounty of America starts to be brought to the notice of somewhat mainstream American food. Now, this wasn't done successfully by the locals, who were largely chased out and ignored, nor by the Americanized West Africans, who could have shared a thing or 10. Nope, instead, this bounty was finally brought to a regular person's attention by these early 19th century immigrants in their foreign ways. They recognized the importance of local fruit flavors and the local nuts. Because think for a second, American eater, what is in your diet that is native to North America? Corn and squash and some beans, yes, but many of the beans, like limas, cannellinis, fabas, chickpeas, and black-eyed peas, are imports from elsewhere. The fabas, the chickpeas, and the black-eyed peas are all Old World beans. And while all beans are from the Fabaceae family, and American beans are all in the genus Phaseolus, the Old World beans, the beans from the east side of the Atlantic, are from many different genus. Genii? Yeah. But think about it. American beans all have a kidney shape to a greater or lesser extent, but a chickpea, a fava, and a black-eyed pea are all very different shapes. The cannellinis, those white kidney beans, those are a bean that left the Americas, were bred to local desires, and returned. Limas were literally an import from Peru. And so along with things like savory or white potatoes, tomatoes, pineapple, vanilla, and cocoa, even though this is American stuff, they're imports from South America. And really just in the last 100 or 150 years. Sometimes it feels like there aren't any good things from North America, but what is really going on is that there's very little that was cultivated to become commercial crops from North America. There's plenty of possible stuff, even tasty and delicious stuff. But the work of taking a wild plant that's specific to a place and turning it into something that is marketable on a national or even global scale, that is a lot of work. And since Europeans regarded North America more as a garden to be conquered and planted with whatever possible, there was little interest in searching out and cultivating anything from the extant wild bounty. For example, the 16th century madness for American sassafras that flared up and then quickly died out did so because the American trees were mined, that is, stripped and discarded for a quick buck or pound, rather than any attempt to cultivate them for a sustained harvest. Okay, and the apparent dearth of tasty foods native to North America is more due to the mining mentality and shaky farming skills of the early colonists. Combine this with the developing American view that foraging was for those savages and the, poor. The door was repeatedly shut on any attempts to develop foraging culture in the 18th and the 19th and even the 20th century in America. So here in the 21st century, foraging the bounty that is North American vegetation seems to be finally getting a foothold among those that think and write about food in American food culture. Will it get shut down again as it has been repeatedly in the past? We shall see. But back to the early 19th century. Even if foraged plant foods weren't making it in the few widely distributed cookbooks, there were plenty of people eating them. For the 19th century, as people who valued foraging as a sensible and even pleasurable way to augment farm-produced foods in the young United States, what was there for them to find? Well, a big one was acorns. America has approximately 500 million species of acorn-producing oaks. Species range north and south, east and west. Okay, it's not quite that many. It's closer to just 90. And while they all produce a nut of some sort, only a limited number produce anything that's worth the calories and effort to turn it into food for humans. In both Europe and North America, acorns have been and are used as a food source, but they are very high in tannins, which, while not exactly poisonous, they are tough on human digestive systems. Squirrels, pigs, and many forest-dwelling birds like turkeys can eat the tannins, so they happily gobble the acorns with abandon. For a human to eat acorns, they must repeatedly soak just about every single last one of them in water to leach out this bitter chemical. So all acorns are technically edible, but all are some work, which means the favored acorns are the ones that are the largest, the easiest to get out of their shell, and are the least bitter, that is, they have the fewest tannins to start with. The resulting nut meats can be excellent carbohydrate, protein, and fat sources depending on the species. Acorns are mainly ground into flour, though a few can be roasted like other nuts, and even a few are fatty enough to make oils from. So acorns are food for many people in the early 19th century United States. It's just compared to grains, or as the Grahamites would say, farinaceous foods, they're more work and don't make the kind of bread that is most desired. Though acorn flatbread, acorn soup, and acorn dumplings are all tasty and excellent. This meant that outside of ethnic enclaves where acorn recipes were brought from the old country, acorns largely, because they were a foraged food, were never going to be used by the sort of person who had cookbook money. Except where an adventurous diarist is recording local foodways, written records of how to harvest, process, and cook with acorns did not make it into the American mainstream until pretty much the 21st century. The one exception were the times where roasted acorns showed up as ersatz coffee. So ironically, while not recorded in the mainstream, acorns were more widely eaten then when documentation was scarce. Now that they are an interesting novelty, much more writing can be found on how to handle an acorn, but their use is rather rare. But acorn seeds aren't the only wild tree crop that made it into American meals. There were even nuts that were tasty straight off the tree, and those did make it into cookbooks. The most famous one, pecans. They grew willy-nilly all over the river valleys that emptied into the Gulf of Mexico. One of the earliest mentions of pecans is in the recounting of the 8-year trek made by Alvar Núñez Cabeza de la Vaca from 1528 to 1536 as a survivor of an ill-fated attempted voyage from Cuba to a location in the middle of the Gulf Coast side of Mexico, about where Tampico is located today at the outflow of the Panuco River. Pecans are a particularly sweet nut and are relatively easy to release from their shell. This meant they showed up in all sorts of sweets in the sugar regions of America, the most famous, of course, being the pecan pralines of New Orleans. In the early 19th century, there were few, if any, commercial pecan orchards, so the nut was a limited seasonal treat that was foraged as it hit the ground in the fall. Receiving a shipment of pecans from the states that bordered the Red River, Oklahoma and Texas, or from the southern half of the Mississippi River, Louisiana, obviously, but also Mississippi, Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, and even a little bit of Indiana and Iowa, was still rare enough at this point that the nuts were seen as a local delicacy and rarely appeared in recipes outside of the regions. Now, pecans are part of the hickory family, and a large variety of hickory trees exist all over the eastern U.S. along with their nuts. However, only the pecan variety has grown to become anything more than a local treat, since opening the shell of most other hickories requires determination and a variety of tools. However, should you find yourself with a chance to try, by all means do. Hickory nuts are tasty enough to be worth the effort. Another tasty American nut is in limbo right now. This is the chestnut. The soft, sweet nut of the chestnut is part of the American story. Chestnut stuffing for birds, and chestnut cream in dessert, and chestnuts roasting over an open fire, and even fattening forest pigs and cattle for the winter market on them. These are all part of the American story. But American chestnuts are currently in pretty severe retreat. Until the end of the 19th century and even through the early 20th century, chestnut was an important wood in building houses, industrial buildings, furniture, even railroad ties and telephone poles. But the same sloppy disease management practices that nearly wiped out European grapevine stocks led to the chestnut blight, all but wiping out American chestnut trees. So while you can find chestnuts in stores right now, check the back of the package. They're imports. Oh, and those ornamental trees you see in cities now, those are horse chestnuts, or for those of you from the East, Buckeyes, as in, yes, the Ohio Buckeyes. And the nuts they produce, even though they look an awful lot like an edible chestnut, unfortunately, just like acorns, they are high enough in tannins to be effectively toxic to people, unless you want to go through the whole water washing rigmarole. But are there other nuts, you ask? Why, yes, there are actually more. There are American walnuts. Now, these were recognized fairly early on by colonists and later settlers as they were close cousins to the Persian and English walnuts. And in North America, there are black walnuts, which grow in wetter and warmer areas, and white walnuts or butternuts, which grow in cooler, higher, and drier areas. Which also means, yes, that squash, the butternut squash name, is actually referencing the native North American nut. And just like its squash counterpart, it is tasty. So is the black walnut. But they are not the nuts you're getting when you buy large warehouse brand walnuts or blue quadrilateral shape brand walnuts. All of those are English walnut varieties. The American black walnut and butternut, they're out there ready to be foraged, but they lost out to the commercialization bonanza for the two regular reasons. Butternuts are more finicky to grow, they hate fields, and take longer to start producing nuts. And American black walnuts have higher tannins and are harder to get out of the shell. So you can find these nuts, and I especially advise chasing down some butternuts sometime. But crafting them to become commercial darlings was too much work, especially when there was already a handy old world species that had already had plenty of work done on it. So the English walnut has taken over much of the American walnut scene. There's also an American hazelnut, but it was also never particularly harvested or developed as a crop. The hazelnut you find in Oregon is the European Asian species. Pine nuts also exist, but the best nuts in the Americas are in the Southwest and are outside of the awareness of early 19th century foragers. We still have to wait our turn for the pine nut craze. So yeah, there were and are plenty of nuts native to North America. But what about the fruits I promised? After all, what native fruits could there possibly be? I mean, I've already explained the apple of American apple pie was an import, along with the peaches and the pears and the. Was there even any fruit already here? Well, there were cranberries, and because they're sturdy, high in acid and other antioxidants, they were resistant to rot and they dehydrate nicely. The result was that while cranberry sauce from fresh and later canned berries would become a mainstay of fall harvest meals in America, the cranberry would grace British Christmas tables. In fact, the American cranberry would shove aside the English gooseberry on more than one table, as these tart fruits were easily exchanged for one another. And then there's cranberry's close cousin, blueberries. They were also an instant hit. The blueberry you get in the grocery store today, however, is a pallid, bloated cousin of the tiny, tart, sprightly wild blueberry. Because most wild blueberries were found on bushes that hugged the ground on rocky hillsides, or came from ankle-high bushes on the edges of forest. The modern blueberry that comes from head-high bushes that are friendly to mechanical pickers, that's a mid-20th century innovation. Which is why the summer blueberries of Michigan and upstate New York and Massachusetts, they're a treat to be pounced upon when you can find them even today. Then there are huckleberries, another berry in the cranberry-blueberry group. And like the other two have in the past, the huckleberry is slowly making its way into the mainstream. But it should be noted there are multiple distinct types of things being called huckleberries. They all have smooth green leaves with prominent veins and produce dark, sweet purple-black berries. They were quickly noticed by just about anyone who had ever foraged along the edge of a European forest, as they have a very close resemblance to European whortleberries and bilberries. But like so many other things that didn't make it into commercial cultivation, they were just hard to grow as a crop and could only really be foraged, which counted them out for mainstream American food fame. Now, these sweet berries are found all over the U.S. and made their way into all manner of concoctions. Their ubiquity is highlighted by the appearance of Huckleberry Finn in several Mark Twain stories by the late 19th century. Long overlooked as a free berry, despite being tasty and on notably thornless bushes, huckleberries are at last making their way onto restaurant menus. A native berry that surprises most Americans is the strawberry. Strawberries are native to the Americas. Many a Native American lunar calendar regularly includes a strawberry moon in their year. And yet the strawberry didn't get much notice until the French and their noted affection for messing about with botanical food plants began to make the strawberry famous in the Parisian greenhouse and fancy dessert set. Like the tomato and the savory potato, despite being an American plant, the strawberry didn't come to the notice of most regular Americans until it made a few trips across the Atlantic Ocean. Though to be fair, the wild strawberry of the Appalachians does make more than one appearance in songs that were developed as people planted their farms in the hollers between the arms of those mountains. And then there are the native grapes. I spoke somewhat dismissively of American grapes earlier in my wine episode, since none of them were making wine that, quote, real wine drinkers, unquote, that is, rich dudes who wanted to keep the wine club small, they weren't making real wine. Well, the joke is on them in the end. While there are a huge family of American grapes that's only going to get bigger as the country does, in the early 19th century, there are two general types of grapes that are best known. There's the Vitis labrusca type that produces the Concord type grape, the fiercely purple one we all experience when eating anything that is termed grape flavored, that is, things like grape jelly, grape flavored candy, and it plays a part in the novelty ultra sweet table grapes like cotton candy and the strange looking finger or teardrop grapes. Then there are the muscadine type grapes, the southeastern grape that goes into sweet muscadine wines, scuppernong jellies, and other local products. And yet most of the grapes that make it onto our tables as either red or green table grapes or raisins are once again European grapes, those Thompson grapes. They're a vinifera variety, the wine type. So yes, we eat raw European grapes, but our purple grape flavor is all American. As America spreads north and west, there are more berries and roots to come, and they continue to be vanishingly rare on grocery store shelves, but they did make their place in storage cellars and onto handwritten notes tucked into other cookbooks. But all of these fruits and nuts, even if, as an American, you've never tasted them, they have likely made some impression on you through the osmosis of American culture. But there are two previously fiercely regional and somewhat mysterious fruits that are hovering on the edges of mainstream American awareness. The first, and probably currently best known, is the persimmon. Persimmon wine and persimmon beer pop up in the backs of early American cookbooks. Persimmon cake and persimmon bread remain regional treats. But the American persimmon is the slimmer, pointy hachaya type, the one that needs to start to blet, that is soften or possibly partly rot before it's palatable. In fact, the phrase sour persimmons was used as a way to express disgust in early America. As a result, it makes persimmons untransportable and tricky to harvest. However, with new ripening technology, more commercial harvests of this interestingly flavored fruit may become possible. The Fuyu persimmon, the reddish, roundish, popular one that almost looks like a cartoon character of itself when you see it in person, that can be open when it is still partly firm. And it has a texture that is more recognizable to the apple and orange eaters of America as tasty fruit. The softness or even, frankly, squishiness that persimmon needs to reach to be truly fully ripe can be challenging for Americans who are used to crisp and crunchy fruits. Raise your hand if you prefer your banana a little bit green. Further, these fruits have distinct and strong smells that are different from the sharp, crisp smells of apple and citrus and even pineapple that Americans associate with fruit. Our tastes in fruit as cold weather people, tart and crisp, means that the persimmon has been a bit of a flavored challenge. It needs to be incredibly soft to be appealing, and so that makes it hard to move around, and so all of these things have limited the commercial possibilities of persimmons. But between the new technology and the modern American desire for variety means that they may start to bring this local American fruit out of hiding. The second fruit that's all American and has languished in obscurity is the pawpaw. Now, as a kid, when I heard the American song talking about that pawpaw patch, I always assumed it was a local name for papaya. That's right, I was more familiar with the pinky orange flesh Central and South American fruit that was likely being shipped to my grocery store from an orchard in Hawaii than I was with the Ice Age relic that pops up seasonally in pockets of New York, Ohio, Nebraska, Missouri, Texas, Oklahoma, and in all the southeastern United States, from Florida all the way north to Pennsylvania. Now, incidentally, there is some confusion because there are pawpaws native to Florida and papayas. But anyway, the pawpaw is related to a whole global family of soft-fleshed, large-seeded fruits that are practically unknown in America. They have names like custard apple, soursop, cherimoya, langnite. Yes, the perfume ingredient. And they all evoke tropical destinations. And because these fruits are so unfamiliar to us, describing their flavor is hard. At their tastiest, they have a soft flesh, like a very ripe mango or a very ripe pear, almost like a custard with a little texture. And the flavor evokes other fruits like mango, banana, or even a bit of the tang of pineapple. Now, different varieties have other flavors, much the way all apples taste appley, but still taste different from each other. And like the persimmon, it has a distinct and softer smell, different from the sharp and crisp smells we typically expect from our fruits. And because these two fruits exist in a zillion varieties and haven't been honed down to the most marketable types, they're ready to take on the variety of weather variations, wet or dry, hot or cold, that are roiling our currently highly optimized, imported fruit orchards. So there are fruits and nuts that have always been here. They started to get noticed in the 19th century by people who were used to looking for fruits and nuts to forage. But the fact that they were impractical for large-scale commercial production using 19th century technology, mainly they were too hard or too soft, most of these fruits and nuts were left out of the mainstream American diet, especially as our cuisine became more nationalized. Local specialties have fallen off menus. It seems like now is the time for the rise of our local produce. Can the American fruits and nuts find their place alongside all these interlopers that got all the early space in our cookbooks, our gardens, and our pantry shelves? I personally can't wait for things to get more complicated and more tasty. Oh, and before I completely wrap up this episode, it owes a debt to the book Lost Feast by Lenore Newman. Now, next episode, it'll be time to look at the rise of the baked bean. Boston, that is. So polish up your bean pots and dig out some molasses because it's laundry day. Thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Stay tuned for more information about the Female Farmer Project and our documentary film, Women's Work, as it's available on more PBS stations. Oh yeah, and I have a shared episode coming up with the host of Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, so stay tuned for that. Downloading the episodes helps me know that you are out there, but even better than that are your reviews. Letting people know that you're listening and enjoying the show helps spread the word. If you want more food and history in your future, I'm also taking part in another podcast, Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters. It seeks to use 20th and 21st century media to seek out America's real self. This is a much looser podcast that still has food, but includes fashion and fighting and fraud and a few other F's, so one of the F's is for fun, which means the podcast is not quite for everyone. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Insta, and elsewhere as @THOA Food, and all this information is available in the show description.